Hi there, this is Madhav, and today I'm doing a quick introduction to all things network science. And I want to warn you that I'm not really one who loves complex terms or fancy words. So when I say network science, I mean studying groups of things, which is, of course, the proper technical definition. I want to let you know what you can expect while we're talking about studying groups of things. I want to give you a little bit of an intuition about the different properties, the different interesting things that we can look at in these groups of things. I want to give you some vocabulary, of course, about the basics, about groups of things. And I want to give you a few cool case studies to just inspire you, just share the coolness of how it can be really important in real life to look at groups of things. So that'll get irritating fast. So I will define what I mean by groups of things. Here's our first network. A network is a group of things. What particular things? The things are called nodes in general. The nodes are what you see as circles on this visual. And in this case, the circles represent thousands of archived documents from the League of Nations. This is the old version of the UN. And here you see all of these lines between the different nodes. Those lines are called edges, and they represent one node being connected to other. So in this case, it's kind of like you have a document that is citing another document. So a network is this, a big group. It's a big group of nodes and edges. So those are the first, three keywords that you need to know. Hopefully those make sense. Two other keywords that you need to know. Here we can see a version of two networks that will allow us to figure out these keywords. So the first keyword is a component of a network, kind of like an island or a community. You see over here, if I get a laser pointer on, you can see that we have two separate bits, two groups of nodes, and there are no edges between them. This is why there are two separate components of the network. And you can see that these two networks, the blue one, the orange one, they look kind of similar, except one has arrows and one has just straight lines. And the difference between arrows and straight lines is that the arrows have a direction. So this is a directed edge. It has a direction. It says that over here, this node is connected to the node in the middle, but not in reverse, And an example of this is just the documents we saw. You can have one document that cites another document, but that second document does not necessarily cite the first one. It's a different type of connection between the nodes compared to over here. If we have a undirected edge, if we have a edge that doesn't have a direction on it, then both of the nodes must be connected to each other. It goes both ways. For example, two friends, you can't have one friend who is, a friend of the other, but not in reverse. I don't know, maybe you have weird friendships, but usually that's not how it works. So those are some key basic words about nodes, networks, edges. Which type of edge do you have? Direction to the edges? Do you have particular components, islands that are not connected to each other? Hopefully all of those are making sense. If not, feel free to go pause the video and review. Now, after we're talking about, the basic vocabulary, I want to dive a little bit deeper into what is actually interesting about networks. What do we want to look at? What do we want to analyze about them? And again, I don't really like fancy words, so I'll do my best to just talk about the simple intuition instead of all of the, definitions. Here we see again two different networks. I don't know if you can see the difference between them. You can see, I guess, here you have a pentagon, and here you have a pentagon, and you have a star in the middle. But, a little bit less geometrically, even, more simply, over here you have more black lines than over here. You have more edges. in the orange network compared to the blue network. And this is a key idea of a network. How many edges does it have relative to the total number of the edges it can have? That's kind of called the density of the network. And you can imagine why it might be useful to think about the density. You know, if you have a social media network, you're just starting out, it's pretty likely that you have just a few users connected to each other. Most people don't know each other. But that's not very useful for a social network. They want to get over here where relative to the total possible number of connections, there's a high number of connections. So you can think about that as a oversimplified analogy for why it might be useful, interesting to think about how many edges a network has relative to how many it could possibly have. Another interesting concept here is to not look at the network as a whole, how many edges does the network has as a whole. Instead, to look at individual nodes. So let's say we look at this top node. What we can see is the top node is connected to a node on the left and on the right, but those nodes are not connected to each other. Over here, though, you can see the top node is connected to the node on the left, the right, the bottom, and the bottom right. But you can also see, okay, the node on the left, it's connected to all of the other nodes that the node on top is connected to. Node on the right, same thing. This is an idea called clustering. How many of my connections are also connected to each other? So for humans, oftentimes we tend to cluster. If you have a church, a bunch of the people there are going to know each other because, they're all Christian. If you have a group of people working at a company, all the people in one department, they will tend to know each other. All the people in another department, they will tend to know each other. This type of idea of which nodes connect to which other ones and how often they tend to cluster together, that's a very cool, interesting idea because you can think about it if you're thinking about the human context, you saw earlier a network of documents, it doesn't just have to be humans, but in a human context, you can think about how, let's say you're trying to organize your company, you probably don't want, just every department to just be clustered in its own little way. You probably want people to collaborate together a little bit more. So if you could measure a property like this, if you could look at this interesting thing about your network, then you could probably be informed on, maybe I need to introduce more people to each other. Maybe I need to set up more workshops so they can meet each other across departments, etc., etc. Here, again, we see a real life network. Over here, this network is actually one that the visual is one that I created with a software that I'll link in the description. But this is a network of people sending each other money, not real money, but cryptocurrencies. So over here, you can see some interesting things about this network compared to the other two. The last few didn't have, some nodes, they were one color, other nodes were another color, and they didn't have, these nodes that are really a lot more, gigantic compared to most nodes. What's going on here? Let's start with the colors. So the different colors, they're based on that idea of communities, of, who's connected to who. You can see that for these green nodes, they're tending to be connected to each other. This green node over here tends to be connected mainly to other green nodes, not much connection between different colored groups. And that is a key idea that is called communities. What are the communities within a network? Which groups tend to be connected to each other? And this is very useful to visualize in networks, in these diagrams, because you can see, we can probably ask ourselves, okay, over here, all of these people tend to be sending money to each other. So maybe, maybe they're in the same neighborhood, so it's the same people going to the same shops, so, they tend to send money to each other. Whereas over here, maybe this is a different neighborhood. These people are buying from different shops, they're purchasing in a different geography, So they might send money to each other. It's also useful, I guess, in that earlier example, trying to figure out, are you getting a lot of cooperation between people in your network? If you have a bunch of very disconnected communities like this, then no, you're not. If you have, just all the blue people hang with the blue people, the orange people tend to hang with the orange people, the green people hang with the green people, then you don't have too much collaboration. So you might see how this idea of communities in the network, figuring out the communities, not only is it useful for visualizing, but also very useful to figure out how do you foster more cooperation, more connection in the network. Now, when it comes to the size of these nodes, I hope you'll realize one thing. They have a lot of edges right here and right here. They're very, very, very heavily connected to a lot of other nodes. So this is an idea of the importance of a node. In fancy words, it's called the centrality of a node. And you have different types of ways to figure out, which node is most important, which node is most central. In this case, what I used for this visualization was to figure out which nodes bridge different communities. So, this node, it is biggest in the green community because not only does it connect to the green community, it also has some lines going over to the blue community and to the orange community and to the purple community and so on. So this is just one way to say who is most important. Another way might be, okay, let's say you have pages on the internet, websites on the internet. The way that you figure out which ones are most highly rated in, like, let's say a Google search, which ones are more important, you just ask which websites are connected to the most number of other important websites. So for example, Google is more important than Amazon in a Google search result because because Amazon, it doesn't have as many connections to it as Google does. So Google connects to Amazon, Google connects to Gmail, Google connects to YouTube, Google connects to all these different sites, whereas Amazon, still has a lot of connections, but it's not as connected to by other very important sites. So this is an idea of kind of like ethics, philosophy, which nodes are most important. It depends on your application. You have to figure out for which context you're studying the network, which nodes seem important to you. I'll give one last example here related to the money. You have immigrants in different countries that send money back home to support their families. These are called remittances. So if you're analyzing a network of financial transactions, then looking at which nodes bridge different communities. So, this node, it gets money from a lot of Canadian employers, but then it sends it also to its family back in, I say it's the person, send their money back to their family in some other country. So now the node, that immigrants sending a remittance, that one would be very important for us to notice in that network if we wanted to analyze remittances. So in that way, the type of ranking that we choose, which node is most important, it affects, what results we get, and it's based on which type of analysis we're doing. That wraps up the interesting properties section. Next up, I'm going to talk about a few different types of networks. Think of them like templates, artificially generated types of networks. And, if you're struggling a little bit with the properties, be sure to look back on, the words that I just mentioned, which nodes are most important, which are most connected, what is the density like, because we're going to talk about these later too. So take a second, pause the video if you need, but we're gonna go back and talk about the templates next. All right, so I assume you're ready to move on into the different types of templates, the types of networks that we might artificially create so that usually we can compare them to something. We can compare them to real life networks. We can simulate how different types of networks might work so that we can be freed from the constraints of real life, you know? I'll give, again, simple words for these networks, but I will quickly mention the technical terms if you want to search it up. And here I have a few interesting visualizations to show off the type of networks. So the first type of network is technically called a statistical network. The key idea is you use different math equations to generate the network. And one example is you might use math equations that randomly create one type of network versus another. This is really useful because, as you can see in this visualization, so you just have edges forming randomly between different nodes. This is very useful for us to create like a template to compare with real life networks, because this is kind of like the average network. What would happen if you just connected edges randomly? But we know for humans, friends tend to connect with other friends. For websites, pages tend to connect to the most important page. So it gives us a template to compare to what we observe. And I'm going to speed this up here so that you can see, after a bunch of these connections happen, at the end, you have a network. It looks like any other network. There's nothing special about it. This is the kind of network that is useful to compare to real life networks where things don't just look random. Now, there are a bunch of different types of statistical networks, but this is just one of them. You just connect edges at random. The next kind of network, it doesn't have just, edges connecting randomly. It is what is called a mechanistic model. Basically, you program rules to determine how edges connect. So one type of rule might be a rich grow richer kind of model. But basically that means if you already have money, then you get more money. If you already have connections, you get more connections. I'll show you. So you saw how, in that case, it just looked like edges were connecting randomly. I'll show you how this time it looks a little bit different. So here you see what the end network will look like. You basically see what will happen. A few nodes will get all the money. They will get all the connections. You see, they're a lot bigger. And if I show you the process of this kind of network forming, you'll see that over time, each new node tends to connect, usually to the nodes that already have a lot of connections. So again, mechanistic model, we program rules about how connections form. In this case, the rule is you usually connect to nodes that already have a lot of connections. And you can see how this type of network, it already looks very different from the animation you just saw of the other network where connections just happen randomly. I'm gonna skip to the end here, but you can see that you have a few nodes in the network with basically all of the edges. So again, this is a mechanistic model. You program rules about how the network grows, and it's useful not to compare to real life networks necessarily, but instead, in this case, what it's useful for is seeing how networks change over time, especially because we can program different types of rules into the networks. So we don't just need to be, most new connections happen with the connections that already have existing connections. That's a weird way to say rich grow richer. Connected grow connected-er. But we can program different types of rules and then see, how does this rule affect how the network changes over time? How does that rule affect how the network changes over time? So that is mechanistic model. Next up, we have a focus on a pretty connected type of model, again, focusing on changes over time. These are called dynamic models or just changing models. And I'll show you an interesting example of one of these here. where this one is actually quite a unique application. So it looks at characters in plays and who talks to each other over time. So you'll see nodes as individual characters of the play, and they're flashing over time every time they talk to each other. And it's interesting to see how, as the play progresses here, it's interesting to see how in some acts, maybe there's a new character that's introduced for the first time. Maybe you have a side dialogue between some characters for a little bit, but then you return back to the main dialogue with the central part of the plot. So for example, here, Arpago, that's the main character, and you can see he was talking to La Flèche, but now he's talking to Cléance and Elise. And you can see how, as these different characters are introduced, well, they talk to each other a little bit, but then it all keeps on coming back to Arpagon, which is how we end up figuring out that he is the main character. Here you can see that these two characters, they started talking for the first time, or this new character was introduced for the first time, or here. And it's, kind of perplexing. You wonder, why is it that you have these new characters arriving, especially as you start a new act? So you just see a whole bunch of new characters were just added. So this is interesting because you can see as the play goes on, what kinds of things tend to happen. One obvious trend is as the play goes on, you have more and more characters. A less obvious trend might be that oftentimes you see these changes where you have side dialogue between a few characters, but then they end up being introduced to the main character, Arpagon, and maybe that corresponds with something like foreshadowing, There is some side plots that they're planning, and then the main character gets that information. So anyways, this is a cool example of how we can use the changes in networks over time to learn interesting things about them. Finally, I'll show you a very cool example. It's, I call this type of network tiny action, big effect. The idea is that you have small changes leading to a very large difference in the outcomes. But the key idea here is that you have what are called agent-based models, where you focus on the things you focus on the things that individual nodes are doing in the network, and then you see what happens on the larger level. So you program the nodes to do one specific thing. What happens when you combine the efforts of all the nodes? What happens at the network level? So tiny action on the nodes part, we monitor the change on the entire network's part. We see the big effect. Here's a really cool article from the Washington Post that did this. It looked at how the coronavirus spreads. It's kind of like a cool visualization of how you get different people passing on diseases to each other. So here you see you have these little dots. Every time one of them touches, that represents person coming in contact with another person and sending on the illness to each other. Now, here you see you have a few people that are infected. They keep on contacting other people, and over time, very rapidly, you see that a lot of people are becoming infected. So the individual action that is being performed here is each node, it moves around. If it comes into contact with another node, then you see that the disease is transferred. So this is just one example of what you might program, what type of tiny action you might give to a tiny node. And then you can see that overall, you see you have all these people in blue. So originally a bunch of people were healthy. Then you have a curve of people, gradually getting more and less sick. And in the end, everyone's recovered. They've got an immunity. And you can also, change the behavior of the tiny nodes so that you can see how that affects the entire network. Here you can see you have this barrier, kind of like a quarantine, being imposed on the sick individuals. and the growth of the disease is slower at first compared to, this rapid growth. And then you can see as the barriers are lifted, then more and more people start to get infected. But overall, there's a smaller number of people infected at any given time. So that's an example of how you change the actions of the individual nodes, and it changes the overall effect on the entire network. So this is a cool article. I won't go through the rest of it right now, but it's a cool application of network science. So as a quick recap, we learned about statistical models. They are used to generate random models like random networks, where you are trying to compare real networks that form in certain ways with what would happen if you just had the network form in a random way. We looked at mechanistic models where the key idea was you program a very particular behavior in terms of how new nodes are formed, and you see how the network changes over time. So it was very useful for figuring out how a network grows. You have dynamic models, which is just another type of mechanistic model. You're seeing how the network changes over time. And you saw in that case, you have characters interacting. How exactly do they interact? What are the trends in how they interact, etc., etc. Finally, you have these agent-based models. These are the ones where you program a tiny action onto each node, and you see overall in the network, what are the bigger effects from these tiny effects on the node level. One very cool case study of this, I don't know if you've ever seen a flock of birds, but you'll have each bird just doing very simple behaviors like following the other bird. But then at the overall level, you have these like amazing like shapes coming out because all the birds are going around each other and following each other's cue. It's very cool if you ever want to search up starlings, those types of birds on YouTube. Anyways, that wraps up basically the majority of the presentation. I've talked about key vocabulary, I've talked about interesting things to look at in networks, and I've talked about a few templates of artificial networks, artificial networks that we can create to simulate what might happen in this case or that case, and then eventually apply that to real life. So what are the real life applications now? First one I want to show you. This one is very cool to me. Here what you see is a network of what is a drug trafficking ring. So this is from British Columbia, which is a province in Canada. It has hundreds of people involved in supplying drugs in British Columbia. And I'll quickly walk you through all these different terms. So the production side of things is people actually growing the drugs, like the plants. The transport is people getting the drugs ready to be sent, from where they're grown to where they are consumed in British Columbia. You have couriers that do that transportation process. And then you have suppliers which, import the drugs in British Columbia and get them ready to be sold. Finally, the retailers, they sell the drugs like on the streets to individuals. And over here you have parasites which steal drugs from different parts of the network. And you have the financiers, so the people actually financing all the operations, and complex over here. All that complex means is they're dealing with multiple types of drugs. So they're producing multiple types of drugs, or they're selling multiple types of drugs. So what's the purpose of this study was, it was to figure out, how do we stop this drug supply? How do we break apart the network? How do we disrupt it? And that's a very cool application of network science. How do we break apart the networks? Not how do we, get them to be better? And one naive approach might be, okay, so you have these financiers, they are connected with the most of the network. They are the people we want to target, but the issue is they're harder to target because, you can bounce around funds. They might be well protected. They might be in countries where they have favorable laws to protect them. So that's a little bit hard. Now, You could look at which nodes are most connected to other nodes, but there's still a lot of arrests that you'd have to make to disrupt the entire network. So what the researchers did that was so cool, I think, was these bigger dots that you see, they're not the ones that are most connected. They're the ones that they have the most niche roles. By that, I mean, they're the ones that perform the most specialized tasks. Like, let's say they transport multiple types of drugs. So if you arrest those key individuals, just a few dozen out of all of these hundreds, then you will remove the most functionality from the network, and that will disrupt the network. I think that's so cool as an application of how you can bend the rules a little bit. You can figure out how to rank the nodes in terms of importance in a new way based on the specific application that we have here. Here's another example. This one's theoretical. You can look at hierarchies. So you can look at organizations, how they're structured, and check how resilient they are. So one way to have a hierarchy might be, in militaries, you have this kind of structure where you have one individual at the top, then, they direct some individuals, those individuals direct some more individuals. It's very tree branch-like, but that makes them vulnerable, because if you eliminate the biggest leader, if you assassinate them, if they have something happen to them, even if, like, let's say they're not an effective leader, then the rest of the organization cannot function effectively. This is often the case. This was often the case with terrorist groups. So if you remember Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group that conducted the 9/11 attacks, they used to have one prominent leader, Osama bin Laden. Now, the issue was because there was one prominent leader, once that leader was assassinated, the terrorist group was broken apart. This person cannot talk to that person. They cannot coordinate anymore because they don't have a link connecting them. This is where you might want to restructure your network to make it a little bit more resilient. So on the left here, you see an alternative example of how a hierarchy might be structured. You might have individuals and they form a larger group, and those larger groups come together to form an even larger group, and the even larger groups, they come together to form a whole organization. It's like levels and modules within the network. In this case, even if you have an ineffective individual, or one of them is broken out of the network, then you don't have the entire network disrupted. And that's exactly what has happened with terrorist organizations in Afghanistan. If you look at the Taliban right now in 2022, they don't have one specific leader. They have multiple leaders in different regions. They are not always the most coordinated. So you have advantages and disadvantages for each model, but they're a lot more resilient. It's harder for someone to attack one person and disrupt the entire organization. I think this is another very interesting, cool example of how in some cases, for the better or worse, some networks might be more resilient than others. Next up, we have a similar example in terms of resiliency, in terms of risk. So what you see here are 70 of the top Austrian banks in Austria. And when you see some banks, they are highlighted in, reddish tones or pinkish tones, that means they have more risk. That means, let's say they are lending to a lot of banks, and, if other banks collapse, then they're going to have a lot of bad debt on their hands. They're going to have to go bankrupt. On the left here, figure A, that is the way that Austrian banks are currently connected, the way that they're lending to each other. As you can see, it's just like a big mess. You can't even see anything in this network. It's just so dense. But on the right here, this figure that you see, it gets the same amount of money to the same amount of people. However, it has been artificially generated. So on the right, this is not a real network. This is an optimized network. It's meant to reduce the risk of how banks work. Now, in this case, they've made sure that, let's say you have a bunch of small banks, they're not lending to each other. So the small banks, they work with the bigger banks, because if a small bank fails, then the bigger bank, it has some room, it has some ability to absorb that bad debt. But if small banks are all lending to each other, then, one bank fails, you can have like a chain effect, a snowball, an avalanche going down the hill, a lot of banks failing and then even affecting the larger banks. And what's so cool about this is it's just changing who is lending to who. It's not changing any policies. It's not changing how good the economy is. It's just changing who is lending to who. And the paper, the researchers, they managed to reduce the risk of all of these banks by 70% just by changing who is sending money to who. This is so cool because the way that they currently try to reduce risks in banks are they have to get new legislation proposed, they have to have expensive measures for the banks to have security, like they'll make the banks hold a lot of cash just in reserve, just in case something goes wrong. This network rejiggling, it just changed all of that. It removed all of that and it did a better job. It got a 70% risk reduction. That is amazing to me. I think, and by the way, again, this is hypothetical. This is still the way that the Austrian bank system works. So there is a huge role for network analysis to play in making our societies, our economies, our companies, our nonprofits, making any type of human or non-human organization, making it better. I think this is so cool. Next up, we have another example with humans. So before, we were talking about reorganizing networks, changing the overall network structure. So you might reduce risk so that you might have more resiliency in case something goes wrong. Here, we're more so studying individual nodes within the networks. So there's this thing called the law of innovation of diffusion, law of diffusion of innovation, where it's kind of like this model of how customers buy new technologies. So how willing are they? You have a small amount of people. So let's say like on the vertical axis, you have the number of people. And on the horizontal axis, it's like how willing are they to buy a new product. A small number of people are innovators. They are very willing to try out new products, even if the products aren't the best. You have some early adopters, they need a little bit more convincing, but they still buy products early. Most people are in the early and late majority, so they won't buy new products until other people have gone first. And then the laggards who are, holding back, they need to be convinced to try something new. So in a theoretical world, the distribution looks like this. You have a few people on either end, and then most people are in the middle. But what we have over here is like a real life data. It's real life data from a network. On the vertical axis, pretend that the numbers they have to do with how many people there are. And on the horizontal axis, it's like, again, how willing are they to try something early? What this particular graph measures is authors on a blogging site. It measures how quickly do they use a new tag for one of their posts. So over here on the right, you see like there is a small amount of people that are very late to the party. They don't very often try out new tags for their posts, but most people, you can see there is a leftward spike. Most people are they try new posts pretty early compared to, let's say, this kind of symmetrical distribution. So what this tells us is for this individual network on this individual blogging site, it tells us that people are a lot more creative. They're a lot more willing to try new things. So that's another cool example of using network analysis. You can compare theoretical models to real life to understand, what kind of people are we working with? And imagine you wanted to get people to be more creative. Well, you could try, different incentives for that. Maybe you set up rewards for the blog posters who coin new tags, for example. But you could use this type of measurement over time to check, are we getting people to be more and more creative? I think that's a cool example. Now, I want to emphasize, you don't just need to have human networks. Over here, what we have is a network of genes. The way that genes work, it's a topic for another day, but genes are in our body. It's not as simple as, you have a gene and it has this DNA, and therefore, you have blue eyes. And if it has like some other DNA, you have brown eyes. It's not that simple. Genes are basically like imagine a stumbling pile of drunkards all like crashing into each other and like you have 10 people that crash into this one person and then that one person goes flying off and hits this other lady and then the other lady goes in this other direction. Like it's kind of like all of these people they crash together, every single gene influencing every other gene, and eventually one of them crashes into the thing that we want. Like let's say they're pulling a lever to do something in a body. It's kind of like, gene A enables genes B, C, D, and E, and then gene E turns off gene B, and then that means that gene C and E are just on at the same time, and then that collides with gene F, and then gene F is the one that, changes our eye color. Anyways, maybe that's too many genes, but you can see every single block here, every single square, that is a gene, and every single connection represents, which genes interact with which other ones, which genes stumble into which other ones in order to, get a certain trait to come about. You see that there's this arrow pointing to this gene. The reason that is because researchers, they tried, figuring out which genes can we remove without having the network just stop working. And this gene disrupted the network the most. That's why the edge between this gene is very important, in the other genes. It starts the entire process. Anyways, this is an example of how you can use network analysis in a non-human context when you want to look at, in this case, biology. Again, you could have examples like the internet, websites working off of each other. In a website context, it might be like this might be a service provider or a server provider. Like let's say Amazon Web Services. And if it gets knocked out, then a whole bunch of websites on the internet will suddenly go down. So this is a cool example of how you can figure out, how network analysis can be used in a non-human context. It goes way beyond. Again, remember, it's just any group of things that interact together. So you don't have to just stick to humans. There's so much more cool stuff waiting to be done. And in this context, this right now is just a sugar production, that's the role of these genes. But you could have another network for cancer. And it's like, why aren't our cancer drugs not working? Well, because there are all these different genes tumbling into each other in order to have an outcome that, is too messy for us to disrupt. But maybe with network analysis, and not just baby, people are doing this type of work. They're trying to figure out which genes are the most central, which genes do we need to disrupt, which genes do we need to change. There are a whole lot of cool applications waiting here. One last example here, and then we're done. So this one is about networks changing over time and how we can look for networks, we can look for changes in networks over time to predict what will happen next. So that's a cool application in like a general sense, but here's what's specifically happening. This is the stock price, these black lines. This is the stock price of a company called Enron. If you're old enough to remember, you might know Enron is a energy company in the US that had a massive financial scandal where they were using unfair accounting practices, and they were misreporting revenue. They were misleading a lot of people. They got their entire company collapsed. Anyways, we're seeing the stock price of Enron over time. You can see it's starting to go down at these key dates. So, here in February 2001, you start to have like a few investigative reporters saying, hey guys, like something looks wrong. Why are they making so much money? It doesn't look like their finances are right. and their stock price starts to decline. And then in August, 2001, the Federal Trade Commission announces an investigation, the stock price declines more. And then in the end, December is like when they declare bankruptcy. So a lot of stuff going down. But at the same time, what researchers have done are they overlaid these red squares, and these are the number of emails being sent by the top 150 executives at the company as these events unfolded. And you can see like 210,000 emails. That's across the 150 people. That's like more than 1,000 emails per person per month. So you can see it got quite frantic at like the peak of the Enron collapse. But you can see ahead of the stock declining, you can see these peaks, these spikes in email activity, and again here, and again here, right before the bankruptcy is announced. So if you were to be monitoring the email activity of the CEOs at the time, you could see how these changes in the network's activity can be used to predict something going wrong. And in fact, this is like such a cool area. This is such a cool area. There is this company called Blue Dots in Canada. And what they do is they look at, network activity, including things like flights, including things like traveling patterns, and they use that to predict the onset of diseases. So, for example, they predicted the COVID-19 pandemic 8 days ahead of time because they were able to detect unusual types of activity in the network. And this is where you have cool connections where they are algorithms because there is so much data. You don't just have the number of emails between people, where you can have AI networks to monitor different types of network activity to detect unusual patterns of behavior. Anyways, I think that is a very, very cool example to wrap up with. And I hope that some of these examples really do show you just how cool network science can be. There is so much content out there that is very overly technical, weird jargon, weird math equations. But if you come down to it, like this is so cool. And I think if we start with these cool applications, it becomes so much easier to go learn the rest because you have a reason to go learn the rest. So if you're feeling like me, if you're excited about network science, I'd recommend, I'm going to leave my notes, the technical notes with all the weird jargon and details in the description of the video. I'll also leave a link to a software that I used when I was doing network visualizations, this one in particular. And there's a tutorial that I made on that. So I hope that some of this is helpful to you. There are links in the thread to learn more. And I hope that you're feeling excited like me with network analysis today.